let's set the scene. Picture Hamilton, Ohio. It's Easter Sunday, 1975. You've got this bright, beautiful spring afternoon. In this quiet, suburban neighborhood, you can literally hear children playing outside, hunting for Easter eggs. Church bells are ringing off in the distance. The atmosphere is totally peaceful. But just beneath this picturesque setting, some incredibly dark clouds are gathering. It's that stark, eerie contrast, right? The absolute normalcy of a family holiday happening just moments before a horrific tragedy completely shatters the peace.
Okay, let's dive into this, because to truly understand this tragedy, we absolutely have to understand the deeply rooted sibling dynamic at play here. It's like a night and day comparison. On one hand, James's reality was defined by total isolation. He grew up in this 1940s home feeling completely alone, facing an angry father and a mother who he felt actively ignored him. Contrast that with his older brother's life, which was just filled with family affection, celebrated graduations, and eventually a happy marriage. James lived entirely in this successful shadow. He was emotionally starved, forced to watch his brother receive literally everything he desperately craved.
Now, this wasn't just some sudden snap, right? It was a slow, incredibly agonizing decline. If we trace this compounding trauma, it starts with that childhood rejection we just talked about. Moving down the timeline, we hit his teenage years in the 1950s. James is mocked by classmates, he's lonely, and he's deeply withdrawn. That despair eventually leads to a tragic, failed suicide attempt. Just a young man staring out a dark window, completely overwhelmed by depression. But the final, absolute, most devastating blow on this timeline? Lost love. James actually had to stand by and watch the very woman he loved marry his successful older brother. Every single step here pushed him further and further into isolation.
So you take all of that, and it builds into what we can really only describe as a psychological pressure cooker. By middle age, James's life is just falling apart at the seams, and his immediate environment totally mirrors his mental state. He's confined to this cluttered, gloomy room. He's drowning in unpaid bills. There are empty alcohol bottles scattered everywhere, which points to a deep reliance on drinking just to cope with the hopelessness. And maybe most alarming of all, he starts developing this fierce, consuming obsession with firearms. These everyday stressors acted as the absolute catalyst for what was about to happen.
But here's the thing. That obsession didn't just stay locked in his messy bedroom. James actually started acting on it. Picture this, a quiet afternoon down by the river. Deeply secluded. James is out there, highly focused, doing solitary target practice, lining up tin cans. There is a very dark, calculated shift happening right here. He isn't out there hunting, he's training. This solitary preparation marks a terrifying escalation from internal despair straight into external action. Fast forward to the literal night before the event. Imagine a classic 1970s cocktail lounge. Dim neon lights, heavy cigarette smoke hanging in the air. James is sitting there at the bar, speaking briefly with the bartender, but fundamentally, he is completely alone. The expression on his face is deeply, deeply troubled. It's the ultimate portrait of a man who is physically surrounded by people, yet totally cut off from humanity. His isolation is absolute.
Then we hit the very next day, Easter Sunday, and the contrast to that dark bar the night before is just jarring. Downstairs in the Ruppert home, it's this picture-perfect scene of nostalgia and joy. A large family gathering is in full swing. Warm sunlight is pouring into the kitchen as family members are prepping food. There's laughter, the kids are playing outside. It's literally the epitome of family happiness. But meanwhile, James is upstairs. He's physically so close to all that warmth, but psychologically, he is existing in an incredibly dark universe.
As James begins to walk upstairs alone, the shadows deepen, and you can see his expression turn completely cold and determined. Which brings us to a massive, critical question. Was this a sudden psychological break or a calculated decision? Was the weight of the rejection, the bullying, the massive debt, and the alcohol finally just too much to bear in a single breaking point? Or had those solitary days practicing by the river actually cemented a cold, premeditated plan? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we walk through these next few moments. So let's actually slow down for a second and look at this exact moment in the dark hallway. James is standing there alone in the corridor just outside the living areas, and you can visibly see the internal conflict warring on his face. This is the psychological breakdown happening in real time. All that resentment from his childhood, the intense jealousy toward his brother, the sheer hopelessness of his current reality, it all converges right here in the shadows, just steps away from his family. What happens next is a tragedy on an unimaginable scale. And we don't need to focus on the graphic violence to understand the horror here, because the environment really tells the whole story. Those peaceful church bells ringing outside, they're completely drowned out by sudden, intense chaos inside the darkened family home. Family photos are crashing to the floor, furniture is being violently overturned. In a matter of seconds, that joyful Easter celebration is entirely shattered, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation.
And then, just silence. The contrast is seriously haunting. Once the chaos ends, the home is filled with this eerie, heavy quiet. Literally, the only sound left is the loud ticking of clocks on the walls. Outside, the warm sunlight begins to fade through the curtains, casting these long, somber shadows over all the abandoned Easter decorations scattered across the room. It's a chilling stillness that perfectly captures the devastating finality of what just went down.
Now, right in the middle of that haunting silence, James is still in the house. He sits down in a dimly lit room, completely alone, and just picks up the telephone receiver to call the police. And honestly, the most disturbing part about this moment is his demeanor. His face is completely expressionless in the shadows. There's no panic, there's no frantic emotion, just a totally flat, emotionless call to report the unthinkable.
Within a matter of minutes, that sleepy suburban street completely transforms. You've got these classic 1970s police cars pulling up to the house. The flashing red and blue lights are slicing through the fading evening light, totally illuminating the front lawn. Officers cautiously step out of their cruisers and approach the seemingly quiet, dark home, completely unaware of the sheer magnitude of what's waiting for them inside.
When those officers step inside, the atmosphere immediately shifts to one of profound emotional gravity. The investigators are literally shaken by the discovery. Keep in mind, these are seasoned, veteran professionals, yet the sheer scale and tragedy of the scene just leaves them totally stunned. They're surveying the overturned furniture and the quiet rooms, trying to somehow process how a sunny Easter afternoon in Hamilton, Ohio, turned into such an incomprehensible nightmare.
Word gets out fast, and almost immediately, the quiet neighborhood erupts into a total media circus. News reporters flood the street, there are camera flashes going off everywhere, and bright yellow police tape is wrapped all around the Rupper property. Neighbors, who literally just hours ago were enjoying their own Easter dinners, are now standing out on the sidewalk stunned, watching this intense 1970s news coverage unfold right on their front doorsteps.
Eventually, all that chaotic energy of the crime scene transitions into the highly structured environment of a packed courtroom. Reporters and spectators are cramming into the room, absolutely desperate for answers. But right at the center of it all, sitting at the defense table, is James. And just like during that 911 call, he is totally stoic, devoid of any emotion. As the legal chaos swirls all around him, his flat affect remains, creating this chilling focal point for the entire trial.
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute core of the legal battle that followed. The trial basically turned into an intense psychiatric debate. On one side, you have the argument for premeditation, prosecutors pointing to his target practice by the river and his calculated actions, but on the other side, the insanity defense, pointing to his profound lifelong isolation, his deep depression, and his complete psychological collapse. Psychiatrists took the stand for days to debate his psychological capability versus his calculated intent, leaving the jury with the nearly impossible task of deciphering the mind of a severely isolated man.
Ultimately, the legal system made its ruling, and James's life shrank down to a small prison cell. Decades begin to roll by. We see James aging in solitary confinement, eventually transitioning into an elderly inmate walking slowly through these quiet prison corridors. His life, which was already entirely defined by profound isolation on the outside, ironically ends in the literal, physical isolation of the prison system.
If you go to that exact neighborhood in Hamilton, Ohio today, the home looks incredibly peaceful at sunset. But, there's an undeniable, lingering shadow over the property. The legacy of that 1975 tragedy is forever woven into the history of the town. It serves as a really somber reminder of the devastating consequences that can happen when deeply rooted trauma and severe mental isolation just go completely unaddressed.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative question to think about. How exactly does a lifetime of quiet isolation explode into such sudden, devastating silence? The story of James Rupert is this dark, incredibly complex psychological puzzle. It forces us to look hard at the severe warning signs of deep resentment, and it reminds us of the urgent need to recognize and address profound psychological isolation in our own communities.
Take a second today to really ponder the true cost of that isolation. Thanks for joining me to unpack this difficult but absolutely important piece of history.